Let me start today's video by making a direct appeal to Aydin Paladin's fans, if you happen to be watching. Please, explain or discover how one person can compress so much wrongness into 20 seconds of a YouTube video. It'll be the first thing I cover, I promise. I also promise there are no esoteric Hitlerists hiding in this piece. You know, for your peace of mind.
Zerschmettert die Feinde des Führers, Vorwärtsverwaltung!
I will, however, be mean, because the facts here are just unkind. So ever since we did that first Aydin Paladin response video all the way back in 2019, we have this game we play, where we check in on Aydin every few months. Pick a video she's done since we checked in last, skip ahead to a random time code, and wait for the next citation in her video. Then leave a comment explaining to her channel how badly she misread the study she's citing. But hey, Aydin's grown as a YouTuber in the past 2.5 years. She doesn't use second person as much anymore and tries to be more professional. And I have done some videos as well. We're not just going back to the well, we're striking the source today, Chads. Because Aydin's most recent video, where she tries to tell you that poor people are just too happy, which despite the title is the real theme of the video, really rubbed me the wrong way. It's the rematch you've all been waiting for. And I will link Aydin's full video in the description so you can see that I am not cherry-picking here. And it's only appropriate we start with my comment on her video, since that started this death spiral.
We do seemingly want more than just feeling happy, and being happy can actually weirdly be kind of deadly. For example, Martin et al. 2002 found that individuals who were in the 75th percentile of cheerfulness, so happier than 75% of their peers when they were 10 or 11 years old, were estimated to be 21% more likely to die at any given time than those who were in the 25th percentile, happier than only 25% of people.
So for those of you wondering if Aydin, doctor in media psychology, has gotten better at reading English, I regret to inform you she still can't pass the bare minimum. In fact, the way she misreads this study leads to believe that she's deliberately misleading her audience. So let's start with the study's methodology. The source is a lifetime study following a population of people and tracking important markers in their lives. The data being used for this study is being applied ex post facto, a measurement of what the study calls cheerfulness, which is more appropriately viewed as people who put forth positive faces to their peers, is being retroactively applied to data from 1922. How are they measuring it? Based on how parents and school teachers in 1922 thought the children felt like. Parents and teachers who were legally allowed to beat these children if they were too loud were scoring how happy and cheerful the children were. Personally, I find this incredibly suspect methodology to begin with, but I can't deny the usefulness and the breadth of data they're pulling from. And to the study's credit, they take great pains when measuring the mortality of the participants, such as cutting the 1940s altogether, since, obviously, that mortality data would be corrupted for reasons. But there's just a concern I raise about the methodology, because the rest is more straightforward. Reminder what Aydin says.
For example, Martin et al. 2002 found that individuals who were in the 75th percentile of cheerfulness, so happier than 75% of their peers,
This is deliberately misleading because the study states in 2 different places that it is not measuring happiness, but cheerfulness, which they describe as the construct labeled cheerfulness is a combination of 2 items, A, cheerfulness/optimism, and B, sense of humor. And here, in the conclusion, in contrast with optimism, which is a more cognitive construct, and happiness, which has a strong perceived emotional component, cheerfulness is a complex, lifelong pattern that leads one in a number of directions. I fucking hate it here. Cheerfulness is a complex, lifelong pattern that leads one in a number of directions, some of which seem to involve unhealthy habits. So Aydin's attempt to lead you towards the idea that it is happiness which is to blame for these ills she's about to list is flat out wrong, because the source cited at the top of her screen completely disagrees with her that it is even studying happiness, let alone assessing what it implies. It goes as far as to say cheerfulness, as studied by them, stands in contrast to happiness. But wait, it gets better.
For example, Martin et al. 2002 found that individuals who were in the 75th percentile of cheerfulness, so happier than 75% of their peers when they were 10 or 11 years old, were estimated to be 21% more likely to die at any given time than those who were in the 25th percentile, happier than only 25% of people, including from abuse of alcohol and other substances.
Let's read the study again, shall we? Although correlations indicate that cheerful children grew up to engage in more risky hobbies and activities than did those with low cheerfulness, this behavior did not predict earlier mortality. Additional analyses indicate that individuals who reported engaging in risky hobbies were not significantly more likely to die from injury. So not only did the study not study happiness, as Aydin wants to imply, the behaviors she associated as being weirdly kind of deadly are explicitly stated to not have an influence on the mortality of its participants. Again, I repeat the question. How does a postgraduate student multi-classing as a professor fuck up reading English this badly? You have to tell me. How does she compress this much wrongness into 20 seconds? But just in case this Gordian knot of wrongness hasn't convinced you, let's prove we're not cherry-picking by examining her very next source.
Erickson and Losada 2005 found that students who were flourishing in school experienced more positive emotions than negative ones at a typical ratio of 3.2 to 1 in one study and 3.4 to 1 in a second sample. However, these researchers also cautioned that positive to negative ratios that were too high were also detrimental. According to their computer simulation, ratios above 11.6 to 1 led to decreased performance outcomes at school. Specifically, the extremely happy presented with behavioral patterns that became more and more rigid over time, making change and adaptation difficult for them. This indicates there are potentially undesirable outcomes associated with an excessive amount of positive emotions, specifically combined with an extreme lack of negative ones.
So again, Aydin is praying that you don't check her sources again, because she's deconstructing a complex mathematical formula to mean happiness. And she's true in a very, I am trying to explain this model of mathematics I am trying to formulate about the human psychological condition to my 4-year-old kind of way, which, in Aydin's defense, is probably appropriate for her audience. But the Fredrickson and Losada studies is incredibly niche. This study is, as I said sarcastically, about forming a mathematical measure of optimism and pessimism. And yes, it is true that the paper described a point where signs of disintegration begin. And, oh wait, I seem to have the aspect ratio off. That's right. Yep. Aydin cut off the title of the diagram here. I wonder if this is a habit of hers to hide information from her viewers. But it is convenient that if she crops the figure in just the way she chose, where its label is cut off, that she doesn't have to show you the other diagram, which does not have the same disintegration effect. But going back to that downslope, Aydin didn't actually read the fine print. Quote, "Positivity must be both appropriate and genuine. Studies of human nonverbal behavior document that smiles that are ingenuine or otherwise disconnected from current circumstances lose credibility as expressions of internal states and correlate with regional brain activity typical of negative emotions and abnormal heart function, suggesting that feigned positivity may be more negative than positive." So the study is pointing out that overly positive behavior is actually a trauma response and a defensive mechanism for people who should, in fact, be considered to lie on the negative side of the scale. But obviously, this is not a controllable aspect in this study. You can't tell if someone's lying this time or being truthful about their positive emotions. Now, personally, I also have issues with this study as it disqualified nearly half of respondents for having any depression-related symptoms while attending university. The sample they have chosen seems awfully convenient for the results they wanted, but again, that's just a curiosity I have regarding the methodology. And my concerns don't remove the fact that it's not studying what Aydin claimed it was. So I shouldn't have to explain that here.
More specifically though, these data are indicative that being happy as a child, having a happy, healthy, and may I say privileged upbringing, does not necessarily lead one to more positive outcomes later in life.
Aydin is pulling this out of her literal ass. It's almost like the facts and logic skeptics don't have facts and logic to back up their bullshit, and Aydin just wants you to hate poor people. Like, she just did the gamers are the most oppressed minority joke, but she did it for real. That's a thing we just witnessed. On the other hand, this makes debunking Aydin a lot more fun, because I don't need to bring up counter sources or replies to studies she cites, because she did all the work for me. Like, when Sargon has a bad source, usually it's because he's using a dumb, often debunked and illegitimate source. Aydin's decided to bypass that problem and just not read her sources, except to search for keywords and pretend any study she finds is backing up her claim. Like she typed happiness bad for you study into Google and just plucked out the results without reading them, assuming Google had checked for her.
That's all well and good for sheep, but what are we to do?
So I initially wrote this joke, just expecting to use this screen cap here, like, haha, we're poking fun at Aydin because we're pretending she's a good faith actor, so we have to come up with a silly explanation other than lying to our audience. But as you can see, I did check a few links here. It's the WAPO article that's of interest to us, because it contains this excerpt. This excerpt features Edward Diner, a man who missed his calling running a Denny's franchise. Let's absorb what it says here. I'll link the article in the video description if you're curious about reading about the stuff Aydin talks about in context. But we've just done 2 of Aydin's sources in a row. What do you think the very next source is?
Oishi Diner and Lucas 2007 posited that there is an optimal level of happiness for...
That's right, it's your boy Ed Diner! You know, Aydin, you could have just changed the phrasing to make it not so obvious. Interestingly, this source doesn't appear in Aydin's bibliography, despite introducing it with the word therefore from her conclusions. Like, they did the studies based on Aydin's hunches. I'm sure it's an honest oversight. Between the writing of this video and the recording of this script, Ed Diner actually passed away. Now, I'm not suggesting that Aydin's video released and then he passed, like Aydin is the scientific equivalent of Rob Liefeld, but that's a possibility. So we'll take a look at it ourselves. We'll start with Aydin's claim about the study.
They found that individuals with the highest level of income, education, and political participation were not the most satisfied individuals. Instead, those who were most happy were those who also participated in the most volunteer activities. That is, being rich, highly educated, and politically involved produced moderate levels of satisfaction, while volunteering produced the most.
So, okay, we need to get into definitions. Here's what the paper says about its definitions. Quote, in this article, we use the term happiness interchangeably with subjective well-being or the subjective evaluation of one's life. We conceptualize happiness as being hierarchically designed to emphasize complexity of the concept. The highest level of the abstraction is happiness, which is a summary judgment of one's life. That is, we do not use the term happiness to refer to the momentary feeling state of happiness. Rather, we use this term to refer to a relatively stable feeling of happiness one has towards his or her life. So, we're having an issue with Aydin's definition of happiness. I mean, Aydin doesn't discreetly identify her version of happiness is, but her words about being happy, this is the emphasis of this segment of the video, and her use of studies that involve pleasure do lead me to think my interpretation of her use is correct. But then again, I'm not sure you should use discrete definitions. I'm not the college professor here. This study is already telling you that this is a more holistic approach to the idea of happiness, that we are not measuring momentary pleasure, but more consistent variables like stability. You know, variables that aren't likely to change day to day.
Similarly, results of their analysis from a University of Illinois dataset indicated that the second happiest group of students tended to have the best performance in school grades and missed the least number of classes. In contrast, the happiest group spent most of their time dating and tended to have the largest number of close friends. Very happy people did not possess as high of a GPA as those moderately happy. Thus, people who are the happiest don't tend to also be the most successful, but instead tend to live more balanced lives involving socialization over work exclusively.
So we have to dig into the numbers, as Aydin is pushing for optimal happiness. I think that's a fair assessment of her words. So what does the study say about Aydin's conclusion that people can be too happy? Quote, "Before discussing our main findings further, we would like to make clear what we are not saying. We are not saying that it is bad to be very happy. We are also not saying that it is desirable to be unhappy. The results reported in this article do not support either of these views. Although it is true that the very happy people tend to be worse off than the moderately happy in certain domains, they still tend to report more successful functioning than do those individuals who are at the midpoint of distribution. And they are usually better off than those at the lowest ends." So, again, Aydin's own sources are mocking her interpretation of their data, and it's true. When looking at the data from the top 10th percentile still reports better than average, or at worst, comparable success to the mean score of all individuals. It also highlights that Aydin is revealing her own blind spot and imposing her own bias on this data. Let's take this segment here. Complete satisfaction with current conditions might prevent individuals from energetically pursuing change in achievement domains such as education and income. After all, the defining characteristics of need for achievement are high standards of excellence and constant striving for perfection. Similarly, if individuals are completely satisfied with the current political situation, they might be less likely to actively participate in the political process. Whereas wanting more may be an important motivation for income, education, and political participation in the domain of intimate relationships, wanting more might be detrimental because it prompts individuals to search for alternative partners and to more readily see the faults in others. Now, setting aside the presumption that monogamy is the most desirable outcome between consenting adults, what the report is saying is that in specific areas, like income, a slight level of dissatisfaction pushes people to desire and perform better. However, it immediately counters that maintaining that level of semi-pessimism does not translate into personal relationships and includes the interesting note that volunteer work is actually more closely related to personal relationships than political activity. In effect, by placing all of her emphasis on income and education, Aydin is revealing more about herself than she is reading off the data to her audience, by declaring it to be the optimal level of happiness. So let's play on Miss Paladin's field, shall we? Let's look at the chart she emphasized so much in her video, and we'll emphasize 2 areas that she's concerned with, just for grins. So let's drop the act and cut the shit. We all know why Aydin made this video, to tell you that minimum wage service workers are entitled for quitting their jobs en masse in the past few months. It's right there in her video title. At best, she wants you to believe they are too dumb for their own good. So look at the top part of this chart labeled income. Now this chart is not organized in a way that's completely conducive to the point, but we can still glean some data from it. These scores, where the highlighted number is, represent the top performing scores. The income rating is scored 1 to 10, with each point representing a 10th percentile of their country's income. So if you're in the bottom 10% of income, you score a 1. If you're in the top 10%, you score a 10. The average score for the most well-performing satisfaction rating in income comes to 5.58 for men and 5.23 for women. Shocking how such clear data of a gender pay gap made it into Aydin's video. Jokes aside, If we are to take that score and lay it on a scale of average incomes in America, that rounds out to the 56th percentile for men, which would be $79,001 in 2019. But the median income in America is $66,790 for that same year, which is statistically significant and supported by the data, which shows that the mean income in life satisfaction is 4.71, or the 47th percentile. But the scores for the lowest income achievement rating, and indeed the lowest satisfaction score, are at the 32nd percentile. That's some 50% further from the mean than the highest achieving score. And even the most satisfied demographic here, which Aydin says are too happy, are still doing better than the mean income rating by a solid point. When in truth, the image that gave her the title of this video here, where overworked retail workers have started fighting back even if they make the previously ludicrous $22 an hour McDonald's is now advertising due to market forces, and if they manage to hold those jobs for a whole year when retail and service work is notoriously right to work, they still barely break a score of 3. Still lower than the bottom level of achievement for this study. This isn't even getting into the fact that the reasons people have for rebelling against a soulless corporate monolith is that their very lives are endangered. Bull Moose Music, a record and media chain based in Maine, is removing a lot of its mask restrictions as the Maine state of emergency is expiring at the end of this month. But New Hampshire isn't as safe as Maine, COVID-wise, and when a corporation makes a decision about COVID based on their home state, they have some unfortunate complications if they happen to have a branch in, say, Salem, New Hampshire, where the company-wide mask policy is far more dangerous for frontline employees. This on top of unaddressed sexual harassment at the Salem location, and the lines between employees and the corporate offices broke down as middle management abdicated their responsibility, all because a bunch of low-wage workers didn't want to risk dying or killing anyone in their families. Bull Moose recently backpedaled on this decision, it should be noted for completeness, but only after major public backlash because of the obvious inanity and cruelty of this decision. Link is in the video's caboose. This logic applies to education as well. If we take this optimal score to be aspirational, the study scores of educational attainment on a similar scale of 1 to 10, with this educational attainment for the most optimally performing men at 4.82 and women at 4.66. A score of 4 in educational attainment means you finished elementary school, and a score of 5 means you dropped out of high school. Yes, the top achievers that Aydin wants to point you towards round out, at best, to a 6th-year education. And not even I, as uncharitable as I can sometimes be to Aydin, believe she's telling her audience to stop their education at age 11. Although I suppose that makes her brand of science a lot easier to digest. Again, I must stress, I am almost positive Aydin didn't look at the data she's pulling. There's a lot of interesting information here if you know how to look for it, which Aydin clearly doesn't. As you can see, however, I can't address every one of Aydin's sources. We just did 3 sources in a row, a total of maybe 2 contiguous minutes of her airtime, but we're already some 20 minutes in, having to reread her bullshit. No one has the time to do 73 Aydin minutes of untangling. Like, what do we do with this level of willful ignorance? We could just rip into her bad ideas, I suppose.
Study correlated data from the U.S. General Social Survey to see how concerns with social issues, specifically environmental concerns, were related to reports of happiness. Very happy people were generally unconcerned with climate change, while unhappy people were very concerned with climate change. However, very happy people were also far more likely to report being active in doing something about climate change and intending to do more to fight it in the future.
It's awfully curious how Aydin is hoping you aren't reading the tables she presents, because the second and third charts she highlights are pretty clearly not labeled climate change. They are labeled environmental issues. That can be anything from plastics in the oceans to spotted owl habitats. And importantly, not actions that would have a significant impact on climate change on their own. The point of this isn't to engage with the climate discussion, of course. This is just an insert that Aydin is using to tell her audience that because they don't care about climate change, then statistically, they're morally superior people. Which, of course, Aydin's conclusion does make sense, but not in the way she intended it, I'm sure. Basically saying if someone is uninterested in climate change, something the US military is adapting to, then they're more likely to think picking up litter will cool the planet down. Yes, Aydin, uneducated people are more likely to make unfounded associations. Congratulations. This article actually lists out a summary of the top 4 actions people can do to make an individual contribution to climate change. None of them involve volunteering, and actually make a point to say that recycling is 4 times less effective than just eating more plant-based food. One of those suggestions does appear in the study, reducing vehicle mileage, but that is notably harder on the less well-off. It's only important because it's the only example they ask participants that is also backed up as an effective form of climate action. Well, Double D, you may be saying, that all seems very subjective and predicated on your assumption about Aydin's duplicitousness being correct. And for you people in particular, you have so little faith. Of course I'm gonna read the study to you. It is important to note that the effects we observed were statistically small. Ultimately, however, we note that the size of the statistical effects is immaterial to the primary theoretical question behind this research. To examine whether, as increasingly suggested by popular and academic writers, promoting personal happiness may be counterproductive to societal and environmental stewardship. In other words, this was an attempt to disprove the notion that if more people are happy, that the world will become a worse place. In effect, Aydin is citing a study meant to disprove videos exactly like hers, something the authors feel they achieved some small success in. And I don't want a bunch of hardened academics coming to my home and beating up the catboy I have tied up in the shed, so I am forced to agree with them that, yes, they have owned Aydin Paladin. Sorry, Aydin. That was obviously just a joke. It's a fox girl in my shed. Like, if I had a study that said my brand of social republicanism was a good but impractical solution to politics, but it also said that big titty goth girlfriends would give you cancer, I would avoid putting that study in one of my videos. You know, I don't want to shoot myself in the foot here. Again, I know the limitations of a YouTube video mean I can't provide the receipts, but this is literally a random time code I jumped to, and I picked the first study she cited and examined it in more detail. Leave a comment, I suppose, if you'd like to see me do this live and prove that your own personal pervert Houdini really can eat cannonballs with her stomach. That's really the best offer I can give you guys, and it's important because I need you to realize how simple this process actually is.
They found a significant increase of mental distress symptoms for subjects who lost their job between 2 periods of assessment, and a significant decrease in these symptoms in those who found a job between the 2 assessments. These causal type data then are evidence that unemployment is not caused by mental health distress, but rather the opposite, that unemployment causes mental health distress. The amount of distress experienced by becoming unemployed was ameliorated by finding employment, such that the level of distress reported after losing one's job was significantly lower than the relief experienced by finding a new job. Further, continuously employed persons showed a small but significant reduction in distress over time while working. This was the case both for adults and for young people leaving school. Employed persons who lost their jobs during the course of this longitudinal analysis showed more signs of distress than continuously employed persons at time 1 when both were still employed. In contrast, continuously unemployed persons showed more symptoms of distress at time 1 when both groups were still unemployed than those unemployed persons who managed to find a new job during the course of the study. This massive meta-analysis seems to paint us a pretty clear picture then, that it is not distress that causes unemployment, but unemployment that causes distress.
Indulge me on this one, I've done enough reading. I also haven't been able to find this study in a timely manner. Apparently telling scientists that you run a YouTube channel where you make jokes about being a catgirl power bottom doesn't establish a rapport with them as much as I liked, no matter how many nudes I send them. I only have to speak up, as Aydin is trying to relay her conclusions, because Aydin has outdone herself again and contradicted herself in back-to-back sentences. Let's start with her conclusion, and maybe you'll hear it better.
This massive meta-analysis seems to paint us a pretty clear picture then, that it is not distress that causes unemployment, but unemployment that causes distress. In contrast, continuously unemployed persons showed more symptoms of distress at time 1, when both groups were still unemployed, than those unemployed persons who managed to find a new job during the course of the study.
If the chronically unemployed showed significantly more mental distress than the people who started the study unemployed but found a job, how does joblessness create mental distress? I know the channel motto is that empathy is a practiced skill, but I am struggling here. I get why alt-right chuds breeze over this. They want to hear a lady voice parroting what they already believe. But imagine you're someone who thinks they fetishize facts and logic, and hearing these two sentences back to back and thinking, yeah, that makes sense. Is this the facts and logic version of bratting? Is Aydin being deliberately bad at her methodology, hoping a big, strong MILF will come in and dominate her with reason? I know I'm owning you right now, Aydin, but this can't be a long-term thing between us. I guess that makes this video the most overproduced silence bottom ever.
Women aren't funny.
It's not even that Aydin is describing anything controversial here. The broad, diegetic reason she made this video is that humans require more to life than money. They require some purpose. But instead of just pulling from the person who first put this idea down, Karl Marx, she constructed this malformed roller coaster tycoon track of how Aristotle was right all along, and here's hundreds of science journals who can take their turn on this dead horse. Because ultimately, that is what Aydin is looking for. Marx's theory of alienation. She knows people tend to be more satisfied working a job, but doesn't understand why then do most people hate their jobs. And this 80-minute ramble at herself, trying to find the answer, bypasses a description it took Marx only pages to codify. But that's Marx. That's the bad people. And Aydin isn't the bad people. Even though philosophy and social science doesn't really have an agenda, you can spin Dr. Marx to support the modern neoliberal state if you really want to. But it's the same pattern we had in our previous response video and Aydin's diatribe about the now horribly discredited, for reasons that we actually brought up in the video, theory of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Aydin wanted to talk about intersectionality there. She wanted to talk about how ableism and transgenderism cross paths and unique complex forces act on people in those positions. But intersectionality is the bad thing. So instead, she tried to reconstruct it from scratch by not reading studies and going with what her gut told her to. And the same thing is happening here, only now it's Marx. I'm a rational person. Now let me just paper mache a Marx effigy out of my cold right-wing reason. Aydin is progressing well as a sleeper agent. Now we just have to send the final code. The hardest part about making this video is this last bit, because the fact-checking, that's easy. It's time-consuming, but I hope I've illustrated how even an above-average grade schooler can see past Aydin's misinformation. This is a case that I want to be wrong on. I genuinely want Aydin to be a smarter person, to try harder and be a better version of herself. I feel, acerbic humor aside, very generous about Aydin in the last response I did to her 2 years ago. Then, I approached her more holistically, as someone ignorant of the queer community that she was treading on. But to see the same mistakes still happening can only lead me to the conclusion that Aydin is doing it deliberately. And I genuinely feel sorry for her for that. And that's not me saying it, that's some of her biggest fans. Because the circle of the alt-right that Aydin peddles in isn't particularly unique in that it wants an honest intellectual dialogue. It's just the corner of the internet where the alt-right is at its most cult-like. Some of the people who agree with my points about Aydin aren't doing so from a point of honesty, they're doing it as a form of hazing. Kiwi farms, which for the uninitiated is... You know when you get ingrown hairs that you just can't nick, and they become those dark red-gray spots for like 2 years? That's kiwi farms on its best day. Obnoxious, unwelcome, if not outright painful, and impossible to scrub out. Kiwi Farm's thread on Aydin is particularly difficult to sift through, but the most baffling thing to normal people is that Aydin engages with these people who speculate on her sex life, argue amongst each other how fuckable she is compared to Shoe-on-Head, and call her slurs, both ableist and anti-Semitic. You can track, in real time, how Aydin is hurt by her corner of the alt-right, but with nowhere else to turn for comfort at this point in her life, she has to go to these same people for validation. That is a cult. Shame you for failing to live up to their ideals, wait for you to cry, metaphorically or literally, and then comfort you. Postmodern conservatism is a cancer. And I say this fully cognizant that I have ripped on her in this very video, and I'm now being sympathetic to her now that I'm not doing the shtick where I take her videos on good faith. Because that's just funny to me. Because I know Aydin's videos aren't good faith. This misrepresentation of scientific data is deliberate. I refuse to believe anyone, besides Sargon, is that stupid. A far more likely explanation, to me, is that this is how she does her penance to her alt-right cult. And maybe this is just too personal for me to be wholly objective. I look at Aydin, and I see someone remarkably similar to me in a number of surface ways. We're both fucking weebs, anime is trash, and so am I. We're both neurodivergent, we're both sexually liberated women coming from conservative roots. Perhaps but for the grace of God's go I, or something. But yeah, I'm still gonna rip on her, because when you have a social conflict, it is incumbent upon the group with the most power to lay down their arms first. Because if the less powerful side reaches out a hand, the strong might take the opportunity to shoot you in the gut.
Well work, Dr. DeSelli. Congratulations.
When the weaker side lays down their arms first, to the satisfaction of the strong, that's not peace, that's just surrender. And I refuse to let someone who broadcasts propaganda for the nonces in the alt-right to get out of it unscathed. Despite my personal sympathies for her individuality, I have 1/6 of 1% of Aydin's subscriber count. I know I'm not influencing anyone here, so I'm gonna keep throwing fucking punches. Expect me to keep making jokes about her Holocaust denial, or the obvious lies she told Destiny, or the 100 other things that are both gross and very silly. And hey, if she's distanced herself from those comments in any meaningful way, let me know, by all means. But I'm not going to browse every tweet for the past 6 years to make sure a joke in this video wasn't a provocative time capsule. I don't really think about Aydin until her community comes knocking at my door from the non-limits of the My Little Pony bondage fanfiction community. Wow, that came out crueler than I wrote in the script. I say that as someone who is incredibly vindictive by nature. I have spent the past week writing this script. I rated to a couple misogynist trolls on Burning Crusade Classic and have spent every night ruining their gold farming operation. You might say, is that true, doll? You died a lot. But I say, I drew out 2 level 70s to bodyguard some gold farmers on my level 50 and still styled on them and even forced one to respec to kill me. Lol, I say I win. Shoutouts to my boys Weenut and Kawaimoto. Next time you want to taunt lobbies by sticking your faces in their avatar's genitals, maybe think better of it next time, or just leave my goddamn game, you misogynist pieces of shit. Like I said, vindictive. So believe me, a second Aydin video in 30 months? As I said, I'm just sorry for where she's ended up in life, that she has to cater to these alt-right fuckwits. But all I can do is point it out. If Aydin wants a way out, those spaces exist. But this is the most I can help people like her. By pointing out that they have compromised themselves to be popular with Nazis.